Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Seán Ó. I'm Executive Director of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, which works on global risks and long-term challenges. And I'm a Programme Director with the Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which works on the opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence. A couple of years ago, myself and my colleague Stephen Cave wrote a paper in which we outlined some concerns about what we saw as an emerging narrative framing artificial intelligence development as a competitive race for strategic global advantage. This is most famously exemplified with some quotes that we've already encountered at this conference from Vladimir Putin in 2017, and this point from the State Council of China's New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, framing these goals in somewhat competitive language. Now, as we've already heard, Alan and Brian pointed these things out nicely. It's unclear how much we should read into this. Vladimir Putin's quote came from a discussion with school children. And the Chinese plan, well, Chinese leaders have repeatedly emphasized how important and how essential global cooperation is going to be around artificial intelligence. Nonetheless, one of our concerns is that certain types of narratives can easily sort of build up and sometimes even reinforce themselves. So somebody writes about artificial intelligence as a race, other people pick up on it and run with this. People are influenced by this, some of them perhaps decision makers who then take actions, which makes sense if we're in more of a kind of a race dynamic. And that again lends credence to the race framing, and the whole thing kind of spirals. And we've seen a lot more public articles and policy reports that frame artificial intelligence in these terms. I've been asked to give a framing talk for this issue of races and artificial intelligence. I'm going to do that by making a number of arguments and suggestions. One is that competition isn't necessarily bad. A lot of competition is good. Secondly, contemporary artificial intelligence, I'm not sure it makes sense to frame it as a race full stop. Instead, what I think is happening is a lot of different types of competitions on different levels and in different ways at the same time. Thirdly, there is not a race, so to speak, towards artificial general intelligence happening right now. The goal is too far off and too poorly defined for something like that. However, fourthly, at some point in the future, a critical mass of people might see this as an imminent thing and such a race may emerge. Fifthly, I think it would be there are some serious concerns about artificial general intelligence being developed as part of a competitive race for security and other reasons. Sixthly, there may be opportunities, sort of key points at which communities like these can really influence the kind of framing of how we develop artificial general intelligence, particularly at key points where, for example, a critical mass of people, researchers, decision makers, switch from seeing this as a long-term speculative issue to something more imminent. And we should be thinking about what we can do to have a positive influence there. One way is by having well-developed proposals and well-developed plans in place that have buy-in from a number of key actors who might have been thinking further ahead on these things. And another thing we might think about is the culture and the environment in which artificial intelligence is developing up until that point, both in the research community and in the broader governance policy and other stakeholder ecosystem around that. And by that I mean practices, principles, precedents, types of collaboration, other things that do or don't alliterate. So, right now, I don't think that it makes sense to treat AI development as some sort of global race. What we instead have are a lot of different types of competitions. There are research groups working as hard as they can to achieve certain fundamental breakthroughs in applications earlier. There are companies looking to apply artificial intelligence to various industry and business applications, whether it's in medicine, healthcare, finance, manufacturing, what have you. We have companies and nations trying to be in a good position to bring artificial intelligence to emerging markets. We have national strategies being developed by a whole range of nations where policymakers are really looking to make sure that their nations and their societies are best supported by artificial intelligence and not left behind, and so that the economies do as well as possible in a future with artificial intelligence. This is all quite natural, and healthy competition can drive innovation, progress, and beneficial societal applications. Now, obviously, there are things that we need to bear in mind. So, in the drive towards automation, we should think about making sure that people whose jobs are replaced don't get left behind. We shouldn't deploy AI systems prematurely or carelessly in situations that might exacerbate biases in historical data. We don't want to make sure that privacy isn't undermined as we push to gather more data to make better applications. But competition isn't necessarily inherently a bad thing. Looking at a more geopolitical level, a lot has been recently written about concerns about, for example, power becoming concentrated both in leading corporations developing AI and in the nations in which those corporations are based or embedded. Scholars like Kai-Fu Lee and others have written persuasively about the concern that we might end up with nations that have a huge advantage that are effectively offering AI services to developing nations in such a way that might be very difficult for those emerging nations to pull themselves up and be equal partners at the table. Companies might end up with a very difficult to overcome advantage in things like research talent, in access to computing facilities and access to data, and leading groups might be able to play an outsized role in influencing national and international governance and regulation. And there's been a lot written about concerns about a military arms race, and by this I don't just mean lethal autonomous weapons. This also takes into account application of AI to decision support, logistics, information gathering, intelligence, cybersecurity, supply chains, the whole gamut of things that makes up offense, defense, security. And given that artificial intelligence is such an inherently dual-use technology in which fundamental progress can be turned into applications, and applications can be repurposed for other purposes so easily, these issues are going to remain quite intertwined with an industry, military, which has at its basis a competitive angle and a security angle that might be somewhat antithetical to the type of cooperation that we might want. Now, looking a little bit further ahead to this idea of an AGI race, artificial general intelligence, right now there isn't a race towards this. Most policy documents talk about artificial general intelligence as a speculative future prospect that is decades or perhaps hundreds of years away. And outside of places like this, an awful lot of AI researchers feel the same way about it. It's not clear how much it makes sense to even think about this as a race when the end goal is so poorly defined and difficult to say anything meaningful about. However, that may not always be the way things are. If we are some decades away from artificial general intelligence, at some point it's going to go from speculative to seeming more imminent. And at that point, we need to consider a few scenarios. One is that this sort of drive towards artificial general intelligence might result in a different sort of dynamic than all of these different sorts of competitions that we've been seeing before this. General intelligence has in the definition generality, a system that defined as Anthony did that would be able to basically do everything that human intelligence is able to do, as well as us or better, would in principle be able to occupy a huge number of niches, perhaps all of them, which might mean that there isn't very much room for lots of different winners. If this technology allows us to make faster progress on scientific goals, economic goals, financial goals, military goals, it might give the group or nation that achieves the technology first an opportunity to shape the future of the world in a way unlike any technology we've seen before. And if, as has been hypothesized, this technology was able to help us with the process of developing artificial intelligence itself, it may mean that the group who have achieved this technology can continue progressing faster than those who don't have it. Now, I don't think we can say that any of these hypotheses are correct or incorrect right now. We've heard a lot of good arguments why it might not be the case. We might have diminishing returns, as Joshua pointed out earlier. There might not be a single point at which something is AGI and whatever was before that wasn't. It just may not be a way to sensibly think about these things. It may be that we have a world in which some tasks are best amenable to AGI systems, but narrow AI has an advantage in other things. But it seems at least plausible to consider a world in which developing something that we can call AGI gives whoever achieves this first this huge global advantage, and to think about what this might mean for the world. And I'd point out that at the point at which this may become imminent seeming to people, beliefs will matter. So the people who are pushing forward towards this, what they think AGI will be capable of will affect their actions, and what they think that their competitors believe about AGI and what their competitors will do will also influence their actions. Now, I think there are really serious reasons to be concerned about artificial general intelligence and the drive towards it emerging in the context of a race narrative. One key concern is this idea of safety. Ideally, we want this technology that has such transformative potential to be developed in such a way that we move slowly and carefully and pay due attention to safety issues, and that the scientists who are working on the forefront of it are sufficiently convinced that they've solved the safety issues before it reaches certain levels of deployment. It may be much more difficult to do that if AGI is being developed in a competitive setting where other groups are working towards the same goals, perhaps not taking the same sort of safety precautions, and so there feels like a lot of pressure to keep pushing ahead quickly. Similarly, it may be a lot more difficult to answer a lot of the key questions about how you would deploy this technology once it's developed in a way that's fair and beneficial for the entire world, how to involve the voices of all the global stakeholders who would be influenced by this technology in a fair and equitable way if it's happening as part of this competitive race. It may be more difficult to share expertise between leading scientists working on safety issues, between companies or between nations, to establish the kinds of cooperations and collaborations we need. This sort of competitive dynamic might even spill over into tensions of different sorts, geopolitical tensions and even conflict. And above all, it comes down to this question of what if somebody wins the race? How can we make sure that if this race is won by a particular group, the benefit is one that results in benefit to all of us and that we all feel is fair and equitable? Now, in an ideal world, we might want to see artificial intelligence developed as has come up a few times over the last couple of days, as some sort of globally cooperative venture, some sort of perhaps global CERN for AI, where we have scientists from across groups and across nations working together, and the benefits of the project accrue to humanity as a whole rather than to any group or nation, where scientists work on this and don't bring it past certain stages until key questions have been answered about safety issues and issues of control, and where global stakeholders are convinced that the benefits are going to be distributed worldwide. Now, it's not clear how feasible or practical this is, but it's a good goal. So, something we might ask is, in the world we're in right now, where we don't know if artificial general intelligence is 20 years away or 200 years away or 2,000 years away, and we have all these kind of competitive dynamics playing out, what kind of things should we be doing now?
With technology, what can possibly go wrong?
So one thing is rhetoric. Rather than amplifying this rhetoric of AI as a competitive global race, putting forward other types of narrative, artificial intelligence as a shared global goal for a global good, a shared global challenge. Another is establishing the kinds of cooperations and collaborations that we need. There's already a lot of collaboration happening within the research community. It's essential that as competition heats up in different aspects of artificial intelligence, we maintain that spirit of cooperation, and particularly on issues like research relevant to safety. As we develop more powerful capabilities within artificial intelligence, there may be roles for different types of openness of research publication models and different types of sharing models, which is something that we and a number of other groups explored in the malicious use of artificial intelligence report that was released last year.
Sorry, we had a bit of a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with less powerful intelligences, you can pull the plug, but it's now plugged in again. Okay, good.
Global engagement. This conference is an inspiring example of research leaders and thought leaders coming together from leading hubs in Europe, the United States, China, Japan, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I feel that we need to be doing now. It takes time to figure out how to work together, particularly across cultures, to understand what our shared values are, to understand what we disagree on and why, and to figure out how to work together. If the stakes around artificial intelligence are only going to become higher, now is the time to start working together in this way. And similarly, organizations like the Partnership on AI can play a powerful role in encouraging globally engaged and globally accountable governance of artificial intelligence. Lastly, precedence. As Jan and others pointed out, scientific communities can play a powerful role in influencing how a technology develops. And the steps that our community takes to put in place certain principles and certain precedents may influence the way that the technology develops in a substantial way. I particularly like this principle from OpenAI's charter that they released last year, where they say, if a value-aligned, safety-conscious project comes close to building AGI before we do, we commit to stop competing with and instead start assisting this project. If more groups were to adopt similar principles and similar practices of collaboration, then I think we'd be in a very good position when it comes to the emergence of this drive towards artificial general intelligence. Ahead of this drive emerging, I think there are a number of topics that we can be thinking on, working on, and questions that we can be asking ourselves. One is, what might be plausible and feasible models for a joint artificial general intelligence development project? How could we incentivize research leaders and experts who currently reside within national efforts or companies to take part in this as well? How would we make sure that this project would be able to really achieve alongside those? What might be ways in which this wouldn't work? Similarly, models for a global artificial general intelligence benefits agreement. Who are the stakeholders who need to be represented? What are the key issues? How can we make sure that benefits accrue to everyone? How can we make sure that if leading stakeholders commit to this, they can be held binding towards it? One question is, what will be good enough? As I think Mallow and a few others have pointed out, it's great to think about ideal worlds, but we also need to consider the worlds that we're most likely to end up in. And the ideal scenario might not be the option on the table. So we need to think about what might not be ideal, but what might be a good enough solution that at least rules out the worst case scenarios that we might be concerned about. Lastly, there's this question about how we even talk about and write about this issue. There's an irony to me talking about races being bad while being up here talking about races, and it points to a fundamental tension in that we as researchers have a responsibility to consider all the plausible scenarios in order to be honest, in order to develop good ideas, in order to engage key stakeholders on those ideas, and in order to open up our ideas to the right sorts of scrutiny. But at the same time, it seems essential that by our actions, we don't sort of emphasize or exacerbate exactly the types of dynamics we might be most concerned about. All of these seem like really useful things for us to be thinking about ahead of time and to have done some really solid thinking of about, so that we're in a position to influence the global community when this comes into view for a kind of a critical mass of global stakeholders. This is a very powerful community, and I'm now finished. It's research leaders, as I said, from across the globe, people who represent the research leadership in a number of companies, a number of academic groups, and some of the key thought leaders. All of you people thinking deeply and carefully about these issues, not just for the future of your own group, the future of your company, the future of your nation, but for the future of humanity itself. And that's an inspiring thing. I mean, it's been really a privilege discussing all these issues with all of you over the last couple of days. To me, it seems like exactly the kind of leadership that we need in order to make the best possible progress and be in the best possible position when we get to this drive towards artificial general intelligence. So thank you all for taking the time to do this, and to the organizers for organizing this. And I'm really excited to know what will come of it. I'm personally feeling more optimistic than I have in years.
What if the plausible scenario is that there's not going to be one point where one group takes over and has rapid increase in intelligence with its AGI, but rather slow progress where a lot of different actors are improving on different aspects of intelligence and might be less easy to convince of your nice project of having this AI CERN kind of thing, because I think we still want to have this coordinated development, even if we're not afraid of existential risk, just because this very high concentration of power could be highly disruptive for society in many ways. Can you think of other arguments to convince key players, especially say military in different countries, to be part of something?
This is a very good question. It may very well be that we don't have this single point that's very obvious to point to that says now the alarm bell's gone off and we need to all work together. And it may be that what we have is more of a kind of a frog boiling in water scenario where we've got this kind of gradual development. It may be harder to make the claim in that case, but I feel like an awful lot of technology develops in this way where it's gradual, and you can have the technology developing gradually where it's still the case that certain thresholds are passed in the impact this technology has in the real world, where something goes from not really mattering that much or seeming fairly sort of manageable to suddenly it being very clear that it requires a new type of governance. And I think we've seen smaller versions of this in terms of social media manipulating elections and a range of other things. I mean, maybe we would at some point have a major cyber attack that makes us take issues around cyber offense and defense a lot more seriously, even though there hasn't been some sort of qualitative shift, but rather a continuous development. So it may be that what we need to think about in that case is, well, even if what we're seeing is something more continuous, we can see that the effect of this technology on the world that we live in means that there's something that's very different now and that will be very different in the coming years than what the governance structures and the collaboration structures that we've set up before this are set up to account for. So I think there are ways to approach this where even if the development is more incremental, we can recognize that something that wasn't a problem in the past is going to be a problem now and needs a different approach.
Let's thank Seán.